All right, if I could have your attention, please. Thank you. What I want to do today is I want to continue my discussion of the struggles for rights among Indians in various diasporic settings. In my previous lecture, I had been talking to you about Malaysia, and we're not done with that yet. But before we go back to Malaysia, I want to start looking at the Gulf states, because I want to be able to show you what I have on the screen. Otherwise, I'll have to log in again. So we've got two different presentations there. One is just a few images that I put together, including a couple of maps of Dubai, which is the place that we're going to be talking about. And then you're going to see very briefly a slide presentation which is on the internet on these labor camps, as they're called. So let me just remind you of the larger backdrop. So the larger backdrop is that in the previous lecture I'd been talking to you not only about Malaysia, but I talked very briefly about situations in the Caribbean, in Fiji, and of course we had been talking about the United States, because we had started the previous lecture with the discussion of the C. Kirpan case, right? Towards the end today, I'm going to return to the United States, because I want to look at this reading by Biju Matthew, which you have for the course from the book called Taxi, right? Because we want to attempt to try to understand what are the various ways in which Indians forge or do not forge alliances with other ethnic and minority groups in the United States, particularly working class populations, right? One of the things I had also attempted to do in my previous lecture, and again hadn't really completed my train of thought there, is I had suggested to you that there are four different sort of, let's call them templates or models, if you want, of these struggles. Four different settings in which these struggles take place. I mean, one could probably think of many more, but if you look at the larger geopolitical context, I was suggesting to you that one of these models would be the struggle against what can be described as black nationalism, or more broadly ethnic nationalism. So black nationalism, here we're referring to countries such as Uganda and Kenya, something that we've spoken about in some detail. And of course the film Mississippi Masala, the setting for that is precisely the expulsion of the Indians from places such as Uganda and Kenya, right? And then we took very briefly the case of Sri Lanka, very, very briefly, because here, of course, we are not speaking about black nationalism, but we are speaking about nationalism. So the Sinhalese, the dominant Sinhalese, in effect, are going to more or less compel India to sign a repatriation act, which will send some Tamils back to India. And the other case we had looked at again, which is not one of black nationalism, but certainly falls under the rubric of nationalism, is the case of Indians in Myanmar/Burma, right? So that's one model, is black nationalism or other kinds of ethnic nationalisms. And the second circumstance under which many of these struggles have taken place is in what one can describe as liberal secular states. And the United States would be obviously an example of that, an illustration of that. And this is where the Sikh Kirpan case would be accommodated under that particular rubric, right? A third model would be what one might describe as struggles in states where you have a deep racial ethnic divide. Now there is overlap between this and the first model, but the difference is the following. The difference is that in countries such as Uganda and Kenya, the Indians were a distinct minority. Right? Now they might have been a sizable minority, so might have been 3%, 5% of the population. If you look at Malaysia, for example, the Indian population is fairly substantial, but it's still less than 10%. Right? Now, on the other hand, the countries that I'm now thinking of, when I'm thinking of this ethnic racial divide, I'm thinking of Trinidad, I'm thinking of Fiji. So here we are speaking about, and of course there is ethnic indigenous nationalism there, right? So this is what I mean when I say that there's an overlap with the model number one. But the difference here is that in a place like Fiji, the Indians were not a minority. In fact, the Indians were, until quite recently, a majority. And I discussed the case of Fiji at some length. Remember, I mentioned briefly the coups of 1987, the coup of 1990, where you have a democratically elected government run by Mahinder Chaudhry, who comes out of the labor movement, and comparable, by the way, to the position of a man called Basadeo Pandey. So I'm not going to write down these names because all of them are mentioned in the article that I've written myself, which was assigned to you for week 9. And in the case of Trinidad, we had Basadeo Pandey, also a person of Indian origin, born in Trinidad, because now we're speaking about probably a 5th generation person, right? His forefathers had come to Trinidad in the 19th century, and he also comes out of the labor movement. Okay, he also comes out of the labor movement. So some of the Indians who've been involved in politics are clearly people who've been, I would say, working in the labor movement, have been active on behalf of the rights of the working class. Very famous example, somebody whose case we cannot take up because we would have to really get into the detailed history of Indians in East Africa. It would be Makhan Singh, who was a very important labor leader and Indian activist in Kenya. Right? Okay. So in this third model, now we're talking about, we're looking at a place like Trinidad, and the difference here is that we're speaking about a very significant population of Indians. So in Trinidad, the Indo-Trinidadians and the Afro-Trinidadians, neither of whom are, of course, indigenous to Trinidad, right? Because the people who would have been indigenous to Trinidad would have been the Caribs. And of course, the word Caribbean is derived from Caribs. Of course, these people were virtually wiped out, right? I mean, we're speaking about the genocide that took place with the coming of the Europeans to the Americas, and most of these people are virtually wiped out. I mean, you've got a few pockets of people here and there, but both the Afro-Trinidadians and the Indo-Trinidadians were brought over to Trinidad. The Afro-Trinidadians coming, the people of African origin coming much earlier because they're brought over as slaves to work on the plantations. And then, as you know very well, in the 19th century, when the abolition of slavery takes place, the Indians are going to be brought over as indentured laborers. Right? And one of the things that I want to alert you to, right, is something that I've hinted at, and I want to reiterate this. I want to reiterate this very strongly. Namely that in many of these situations you have what can be described for the sake of convenience as two immigrant groups, effectively. Two immigrant groups, that is the Afro-Trinidadians, the Indo-Trinidadians here now, right, locked in battle, right, and claims of priority, that is that we came first, it seems to me are not effective claims, because the fact of the matter is that both of them in a certain way can be viewed as interlopers. Both of them can also be viewed now as the people who rightfully lay inheritance claim to that place, right? Because there is no indigenous population as such. Now the case of Fiji here is quite different, because in Fiji, even though the Indians were a majority, you had an ethnic Fijian population, right? And one of the questions that we would have to ask is whether the claim of an indigenous group such as that in Fiji is stronger than the claim of, let's say, people of Afro-Trinidadian descent, okay, in a place like Trinidad. Right? Is it stronger merely by virtue of the fact that a group is indigenous? And I don't think that this matter can be resolved simply by saying that, well, the indigenous people have certain claims which take precedence over the claims of other groups, because, of course, we have to understand, what are the ways in which people labor to build a society? Right? What are the ways in which people labor to build a society? So, for example, in the United States, and this is a question I think that comes up in the Taxi book, and I'm going to read some excerpts from that book towards the end of my lecture today. But one of the questions that comes up there is, is it even appropriate to tell somebody who's an immigrant to the United States, when they have a complaint? So let's say a taxi driver who feels aggrieved for various reasons, and a passenger who's sitting in the taxi, a white passenger, there's a scene where he describes that actually in the book, where the scene is, let me tell you what the excerpt here is. the book describes a Pakistani taxi driver who picks up a passenger. Okay, he picks up this passenger, and this is a white male passenger, and on the radio, so the radio is on in the taxi, and on the radio it's WKPFK. I don't know how many are familiar with this radio station. It's kind of what's considered a left-wing radio station in the United States. Right? What is left-wing here is not always left-wing elsewhere in the world, but certainly by American standards, it's left-wing. Right? So it's critical of American foreign policy, all of that. And there's a program coming, and the passenger, when he's listening to it now, and he can't believe what he's listening. Right? He just cannot believe it. He's shocked. And so he tells the driver that, look, I mean, how dare you have this radio station on when I'm in the cab? And the guy says, well, look, I mean, it's my cab. I'll do whatever I want to do. And this person then the passenger starts to get abusive. Right? And eventually he retorts with the line that we have all heard, at least I have, many times in the 25, 30 years that I've been here. Well, if you don't like the U.S., why don't you go back to where you came from? Right? That's the line. And this is what that excerpt is really about. And of course, what the author of the book is saying, this is absurd. This is absurd, because this idea that, well, look, I'm the true immigrant here. This country is my inheritance, right? If a person says that this country is my inheritance and the others are all, people who came later on, well, this is simply a question of priority of arrival, right? So the Anglo-Saxons came first, so therefore they have greater claim to this country, and then the Italians came after that, and the Scandinavians came somewhere in between. So all of these groups have precedence over, the Chinese and the Japanese, and of course the Indians, so forth and so on. Right? I mean, that's frankly an absurd argument, if you ask me, right? Because all of these groups are immigrant groups. All of them are. And of course, the only group that is not an immigrant group is the Native Americans, who, frankly, have no claim to this country at all now. I mean, there are all these nice rhetorical gestures that people make to the Native Americans, but frankly, no one gives a hoot. And we know what the situation is of Native Americans in this country. I mean, it's absolutely desperate. Okay, right? So that's the context that you have to keep in mind. So when we take a look at a place like Fiji, the question here is that, well, how are the claims of the ethnic Fijians actually different than the claims of the Indians? And I can tell you that in Fiji, the interesting situation is that the Indians own only 2% of the land. Only 2% of the land is actually owned by Indians, but the entire farming is done by Indians. And so, in fact, when I was in Fiji for the first and only time, which was about 1997, I found out that the Indians who were farming the lands, they were farming these lands on lands that had been given to them on what were called 99-year leases. So these leases were in fact actually expiring in 1997, close to 1997. And the question that was coming up was, well, what would be the circumstances under which Indians would get the renewal of these leases? Because of course, by this point in time, remember that 2 coups had already taken place in 1987. By this point in time, there was already substantial outward migration. Now, if you want to drive the Indians out, you can obviously, when the leases come up for renewal, you can obviously make the terms of the leases difficult for the Indians. Okay? So who owns the land? The land is owned by the ethnic Fijians, but they don't actually farm the land. Right? So they own about 90% of the land. 8% of the land is roughly owned by the state, okay? And the remaining 2% is owned by these Indians. And you might recall what I said to you, that when I was there, I found that, well, all the professionals, virtually all the professionals were Indians. So I'm talking about the doctors, the engineers, the teachers. Right? Bulk of the university professors. You're at the University of the South Pacific, which is a major university there. Right? It's really the only university. Now they've got another new university that has been set up very, very recently, which is predominantly for the Indians. But the faculty at the University of the South Pacific, large number of Indians over there. Right? So they're in the professions, they run the shops, they do the farming. And the question that I had was, well, what do the ethnic Fijians do? What do they do actually? right? How are they employed? And this is when I found out, and I remember this was my concluding remark here, was that, well, in fact, on Thursday, that what they do is they, in fact, work for the government. They work for the state. And, of course, the state patronage means that, you know, for every one person that you need for a job, you actually employ 4 or 5, because there really isn't provision to employ that many people. But you have to keep them employed. You give them state patronage, right? And essentially, this is what happened in a place like Malaysia as well, which is the other case I'd discussed. Right, so these are 3 models. I'll fill up this scenario in a little while, but let me now go to the case of Dubai, because in effect what it does is it gives us a 4th model now. And what is this 4th model here? Dubai. Okay, and where so here, let me just show you a couple of these stills very quickly here, just so that you get some idea what we're talking about. So these are Indians on the waterfront, and I'll show you a couple of maps of Dubai to show you exactly where it is. If Indians have to use public spaces in Dubai, it's usually the waterfront, because to go to a park, you have to pay a fee, almost any park in Dubai. Okay, and the bulk of these Indians, now how many Indians are we talking about, by the way? 1.5 million as of last year. Okay, 1.5 million Indians in Dubai, which is a very small place. So they are the largest national ethnic group. They outnumber the Arabs, the people, you know, quote, the indigenous people, if you want to call it that. They outnumber them, okay? And here we have, you know, you see an image of Indians working to build the new Dubai, a shimmering city of, you know, skyscrapers, extravagance beyond belief, in fact, actually. Okay, and here, just to give you a sense of the contrast, this is, the top photograph is a picture of what Dubai Creek, okay, which cuts through the city, right? The top, what it looked like in 1960, and the bottom, what it looked like in 2008. You can see the enormous amount of development. Of course, all of it coming from oil revenues. All of it coming from oil revenues. Oil is much less expensive than water in Dubai. But there's no shortage of water, by the way, because, you know, they have extensive desalination plants. So they take you know, the salt water and they process it. And of course, there's also the wealthy class imports virtually all of its drinking water. Just a couple of images. This goes back to the 1930s. And this is a composition which is partly a photograph and partly a painting. You know, in the background you can see the dhows. The dhows are these sailing boats, the famous sailing boats that you find in the Indian Ocean area. Even if you go to places like Zanzibar, East Africa, you would have seen dhows. So here's a map here, and United Arab Emirates is only one of 6 of these Gulf states. Okay, and Dubai itself is part of the United Arab Emirates. Right? So Dubai is over here, right over here, where it says D-U-B-A-Y-Y over here, and the modern spelling is D-U-B-A-I. So this is the Abu Dhabi is the capital over here. Okay, and it's bordered to the east by Oman, to the south by Saudi Arabia. Then on the north is Iran over there, and Qatar. Qatar, some of you might be familiar with, because Al Jazeera, you know, the famous satellite cable television station is based in Qatar. And some of the other places that you see, so if you look at the top right-hand side there, on the coast, the left coast, Ras Al Khaimah, Kwan, these are Ajman, these are the other you know, parts of what is called the United Arab Emirates. Okay, here's another map which gives you a slightly better sense of what we're talking about. Abu Dhabi in the middle, and then if you go further along the coast there, you see Dubai, Sharjah, Ajman, Ras Al Khaimah. All right, and here is a detailed map of the Dubai metro area. So there you can see Dubai Creek running through the city. Okay, and the image that you saw, this image over here, okay, over here. So there, that's Dubai Creek there, and you can see on both banks of it, by 2008, you had enormous amounts of development that had taken place, right? And I would say that, and I don't think that anybody would really contest this. I mean, Dubai has been built really on the back of the labor of South Asians. The Indians being the largest community, but certainly there are Pakistanis, Bangladeshis. There's a substantial working class from places like the Philippines now, especially women. Why? Because, for example, countries like Pakistan do not allow single women to emigrate, okay, to places like Dubai. You cannot. Even, by the way, in India, you know, I have an Indian passport. I've had an Indian passport for years, of course. Until about 10, 15 years ago, there used to be a stamp at the back of an Indian passport, and the stamp would be immigration clearance, required or not required. So for people like me, it would not be required because they knew that I was not part of the laboring class, the working class. But if you were part of the working class, then you needed immigration clearance. Immigration clearance. And what does that mean? What that meant was that this was ostensibly a measure taken by the Indian government to ensure that people who were part of the working class, who were going to places like Dubai, were going with the knowledge of what they were doing, had the right papers, because otherwise they were walking into a situation that was highly exploitative, as you'll see very shortly. Highly exploitative, okay? And we're speaking not only of Dubai, but we're speaking of the Gulf states as a whole here. And in fact, actually, the Indians of Dubai, when they speak of Dubai, as the reading that you have you know, on Dubai from week 9 suggests very clearly that sometimes they're referring to Dubai Creek, so the western part of Dubai Creek, which is the older part of the town. Sometimes they're referring to the entire city of Dubai. Sometimes by Dubai they're actually referring to the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and sometimes they're in fact referring to the entire Gulf region. Right? So the word, there's a great deal of slippage in how this word is used by people in Dubai itself. So now going back to this image then, so there's Dubai Creek running through the city. Bur Dubai is the historic district that you see, you know, on the west. There's one Hindu temple, by the way, in Dubai, and that's on the western part of the town. All right, now we're done with that, but let me show you this other presentation, which is this slideshow, which is on the internet. And did we get it there? Yeah, okay, right. So the construction of Dubai is being completed largely by illegal immigrant Indian workers. Why do they say illegal? Many of the Indians who come over to Dubai, they don't have the appropriate paperwork. Some of them do. Okay, and there are many stories that are circulated about Dubai, such as the fact that, as people argue, it's a tax-free haven. Okay, well, that's entirely inaccurate. It's a tax-free haven for those who are very rich. But if you're part of the Indian working class, in fact, it can be a nightmare, because in order to work in Dubai, so for example, let's say an Indian gets on a boat, gets to Dubai. It's not a very long journey today, right? Not a very long journey. You get on a boat or you get on a plane and you get to Dubai. First thing is that you're going to pay your agent a substantial amount of money. Okay, you're going to pay your agent a substantial amount of money to get you into the country. Most of these people who are coming are quite illiterate. Before they've gone to Dubai, for example, as part of the working class, they don't have a passport. So they need to have a passport made. Usually there'll be a substantial amount of extortion in India itself, okay, by middlemen, right? So we're talking about all the costs involved in getting this Indian over, right? And usually, as in the case of the 19th century. So now we're going back to the 19th century scenario, because if you remember the scenario that had been suggested to you when we were looking at Indian indentured labor, that many of these people were lured into going. False promises were given to them. How much money you'd be making, for example, in Trinidad and so forth and so on. Exactly the kind of scenario that surfaces again when we look at Dubai. So if you read these stories of many of these people which have been accumulated by human rights groups such as Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and I would urge you, by the way, go to the internet and just look up, just type in Human Rights Watch, reports on illegal labor or labor camps in Dubai or conditions of immigrants in Dubai. You'll get quite a few documents over there. And many of these documents will give you first-hand stories of people who've been interviewed. Right? So what I'm really giving you is a capsule summary drawn from many of these reports. And many of these people who've been interviewed have in fact quite openly stated what are the conditions under which they came, what are the conditions under which they're held in Dubai. So very often, as soon as they arrive in Dubai or anywhere else in the UAE. Okay, and so remember that when I speak of Dubai here, I'm not speaking only necessarily of Dubai. That's the main illustration here, but it could be elsewhere in the Gulf states as well. It could be elsewhere in the United Arab Emirates. So when they arrive there, very often, not always, their passport will be held, will be confiscated by the company that has hired them. Right? All right? And of course, what that does is it immediately restricts your freedom of movement. And it means, in turn, that now you're going to have to continue to work until such time as the company claims that you have repaid the debt you incurred when you came over. Right? Because the passage costs obviously a certain amount of money, and some people cannot pay for the passage themselves. So that's the larger context for discussion of what is meant when we speak about illegal immigrant workers. So let me move to the next image over here. Okay, so they're brought into the bus each day from their camps. This is, by the way, this photo article appeared in The Guardian, and there's a text that accompanies it as well, a companion piece, in fact, actually. All right? Working day is very often going to be 12 hours a day. So you're housed in what is called a labor camp, which is usually on the outskirts of the city. Right? And then you're going to be brought into the city very often early in the morning, and you will usually leave around 8 or 9 in the evening. These men are part of a huge scam that is fueling the construction boom in the Gulf. And you've already seen evidence of that construction boom, and just in that picture of the Dubai Creek in 2008. Okay, so as I said, one of the open spaces that is in fact actually available to these workers is usually the seacoast, because most of the other spaces would be close to them. Okay, so in fact, this article claims that the working day can be up to 18 hours a day. 18 hours a day, right? And then they're going to be escorted back to the labor camp on the bus. So you can just read the caption for yourself. So here is an image which gives you some idea of their living conditions. A bucket is employed as a washing machine. Right? And we're speaking here, of contemporary times. I mean, these are images. This is from October 2008. This okay, dinner is prepared in grease blackened pans. And by the way, this laboring force is almost entirely single and male. I mean, if they have families, the families certainly do not come over. Right? And I mentioned to you that countries such as Pakistan officially will not allow single women to emigrate here. So of course, in places like Dubai, they need women as part of the labor force too. For example, as nurses. Right? So this is where you find a large number of Filipino women, working as domestic laborers, working as nurses, and so on. There are Indian women as well. Typical meal consists of a few chilies, an onion, and 3 tomatoes, along with a piece of bread. Okay, and this is something that this is a pulao rice. Pulao is rice with meat here. A dish that has been brought back by one of the workers who had taken a trip back to his village in Pakistan. And of course, what this image is attempting to do is it's trying to suggest the irony of it, because these are the people who are working at the construction sites. They're working in hotels, as busboys, as cooks, as drivers, as washermen, as doormen, right? And their food. So when they eat, up to 20 people, by the way, in a room. Up to 20 people in a room, and again, documented by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and numerous other human rights groups. So they put newspapers on the floor, and these newspapers are, of course, advertising all of these expensive commodities, which are easily available in Dubai. I mean, that's one of the reasons why a large number of Indian middle class people go to Dubai. Those trips have diminished now, because now Indians have access, particularly after neoliberalization and all of that, to large parts of the West. And if you have money in India, you'd rather go to Switzerland or the United States than to Dubai. But certainly in the 1980s, for example, up till, I would say, the late 1990s, Dubai was in fact the favorite destination for many Indian middle class people who were looking for luxury goods and so on. This is where you would go and get them, because at least in principle it was supposed to be also duty free. Okay, and so a moment of leisure amidst the work. In certain areas, up to 20 men share a room. So UN agencies estimate that there are up to 300,000 illegal workers in the Emirates. And one last slide over here to conclude this presentation here. So many of the men have had their passports taken away by the employment agencies. They paid to come here and do not know when they will be able to, go back home. All right. Now let me say a little bit more about the Dubai, the situation in Dubai. So it's part of the United Arab Emirates, of course, and it's and the UAE is itself one of the 6 Gulf states that we have. Bahrain, for example, would be another one of these Gulf states. Now, the reading that you have suggests that the situation of Indians in Dubai is very peculiar. It's very peculiar, and it cannot be accommodated under the kinds of diasporic migration patterns that we're familiar with. Right? So we're familiar with, let's say, Indian diasporic groups in the United States, and we know the context under which Indians came over here. And of course, a very substantial number of these Indians are now American citizens, and if they're not American citizens, they're permanent residents. In fact, the vast majority of the 3 million Indians that you have here now would fall under one of these 2 categories, because the only people who would not fall under these 2 categories, and they're not really even counted in the diasporic population, are people who are coming on, let's say, student visas. Okay, so let's say the 70,000 Indians who come to the United States on a student visa every year. All right, or people who are coming on H-1B visas. So H-1B visas are visas that are given to professionals. Okay, and in some years, 50% of all the H-1B visas that have been issued in the United States have been given to Indians. 50%. Okay, so we're talking about people working in the software industry, working in the Silicon Valley, or working in some of the other professions, right? In medicine, in medical schools and hospitals, and so on. So these would be the people who are the exceptions. But otherwise, we're saying that in fact the Indians who are part of the diasporic population here are either citizens or permanent residents. And this is true even of the Indians, of course, in places like Trinidad and Fiji. Now, we have seen clearly that simply being a citizen doesn't give you protections necessarily. So even though the Indians are citizens of Fiji, a large number of them felt compelled to migrate. And whether they were forced to migrate or whether they were compelled to migrate, it's a thin line there. Right? Because if you have a military coup, if a democratically elected government is overthrown, obviously it puts a certain degree of anxiety in the mind of people. And if your leases have expired and you don't know the conditions under which these leases are going to be renewed, so I'm suggesting to you that the psychological trauma that some of the Indians may have experienced may have been quite considerable, and this outward migration should not be viewed only as a voluntary migration, that there are things that are pushing them out. On the other hand, it's not expulsion. This is not, the case of Fiji is not the case of Uganda, okay, under Idi Amin. Quite different. Right? But there's a thin line there. But nonetheless, at least they were citizens. In Trinidad, they're citizens. In South Africa, they're citizens. The case of Fiji, if the case of the Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, is very different. You have Indians who've been settled there for, let's say, 4 decades. So I think the oldest settlement in the modern period that we're speaking about would be approximately 4 decades, about 40 years. And in fact, this reading suggests that the length of stay creates its own hierarchy, that those who have come much more recently are viewed as being lowest in the hierarchy. Those who came earlier are viewed as being highest in the hierarchy. There are different kinds of hierarchies. That's one hierarchy. There's another hierarchy, which is a hierarchy of what kind of work you have. So Neha Vora, in the book that you've been reading, Impossible Citizens, she suggests, in fact, according to what one of the informants told her, right, that there are in fact actually 7 classes of Indians in Dubai. You begin at the rock bottom. The rock bottom are those who work at the labor camps. Those are the people whose images that you saw there in the slideshow. Right? So these are people who are bussed into the city, and then at the end of the day they're removed. Right? Essentially, you don't want, people shouldn't have to see them. Right? That's the situation that is effectively being described. So this is the lowest rung. Then you have the Indians who are working in the city itself, but working in what you would call the lowest blue-collar jobs. Right? So this would be busboys, cooks, drivers, washermen, so forth and so on, messenger boys, etc. Then you're talking about the Indians. The third rung from the bottom would be the Indians who are doing clerical work. Right? So this is now pushing you slowly into the white collar, but this is low-level clerical work. Okay, then a fourth rung would be the Indians who have some degree of responsibility working in an office. Right? They're not supervisors, but they have some degree of responsibility. They're a bit more than just clerks. And then you've got the fifth rung, which is the Indians who are now working in these offices, have some degree of authority, some degree of supervision is allowed to them. Right? And then you've got the top 2 rungs, moving to the professionals, and then moving to those Indians who, as she says, live in places like Internet City and so on, which is a part of Dubai. Right? Because these are people who are highly paid and so on. And mind you, by the way, that all of these people, even the ones who are at the highest rung, will be paid much less than Europeans for exactly the same kind of work. Because when you come into Dubai, there is a tiered structure not only among the South Asians, but the Dubai government, but the state, in fact, sanctions officially, right, forms of discrimination in the sense that Europeans get paid the highest. So you have these expats, as they're called. Okay, and then the South Asians would be a rung lower than that, and then within that the hierarchy that I've established. All right. So now what we're saying is that there are these different forms of hierarchy, but one thing is common to all of the Indians: none of them have citizenship rights. None of them have citizenship rights. So the first problem that she begins with in her book is trying to understand, well, where does one locate these Indians? Okay. Now, you can't really call them expats. The expats are usually, or expatriates, are usually the Europeans who have come here to Dubai. They've settled down, let's say, for 5 years or 10 years, something of that kind. They're doing business, right? And then eventually they're going to leave. And whether they have citizenship rights or not, frankly, doesn't really matter, because they have access to all the spaces. They have privileges. Now, the Indians are not clearly expats. On the other hand, not all of them can be viewed simply as migrant laborers, because a migrant laborer is somebody who goes for a short period of time, right, and then returns. And certainly some of them will fit that category, but many of the Indians will not. So some of the informants that she spoke with, the family that she stayed with, they'd been living there for, let's say, a decade. So you've got families that have been living there for a decade, 2 decades. And when she started talking to the Indians there, the first thing that they told her was that Dubai, it's like an Indian state. It's the westernmost part of India. That's how many of them thought of it. So one person, in fact, actually one informant told her that, well, Dubai is like Bombay, it's just a clean Bombay. Right? It's just a clean Bombay. We don't feel out of place here at all. And so the chapter that you're reading, An Indian City, it describes very briefly what Dubai is like, what are the ways in which Indian culture has meshed in with local culture. So she points out, for example, that Indian music, Indian cuisine, right, is very popular. That the women, for example, wear the salwar kameez underneath their abayas, right? That in fact the older Arabs in Dubai, even though the currency today is dirhams, they actually refer to rupee and paisa, which is the currency in India, as you know, is rupee. At one point used widely in East Africa. The official currency of Kenya used to be the rupee. It gives you an idea of how widespread the Indian diasporic population was, and the way in which it had made inroads. Now, so she's saying that the older Arabs in Dubai still refer to the rupee and the paisa. Yes, question?
You briefly mentioned the families that some of these individuals had.
Yes.
If the migrants are largely single men,
yes,
and they don't have citizenship rights, who are they marrying?
No. But because these informants that I'm talking about, like
they were the fit.
Yeah, this is the professional semi-professional class. The images that you saw of these are not migrant laborers that I'm talking about now, right? In other words, the informant family that she stays with, right, who have lived there for 10 years, who's the husband is a professional, right? Those are people who obviously are privileged. But all the privilege is relative, right? Because relative to the expats, the European expats are obviously not as privileged. The migrant laborers that I'm talking about, these are people who belong to those lowest rungs that I was enumerating very briefly for you. We're talking about rungs 7, 6, maybe 5 at best, but certainly the two bottommost layers. All right? So the first question here is, when we start looking at the Indian population in Dubai, we're talking about a population that has no citizenship rights. And one of the problems that she's alerting us to is that when we think of citizenship, we immediately think of the template of citizenship in a liberal secular state. Okay? It may not be entirely secular, but certainly a liberal state. So we think of, okay, what are the problems that Indians may or may not have encountered in obtaining citizenship rights in the United States at one point in time? And then we think now of how citizenship works. What are the entitlements? What are the privileges? Of course, there are obligations as well. Most people don't want to think of the obligations. You simply think of the rights and the entitlements and the privileges that come with citizenship. Right? But she's saying that this model, frankly, will not be particularly illustrative, particularly useful in trying to understand the position of Indians in Dubai. So we've got Indians there who have come very recently, and then we have Indians who've been there for 3, 4 decades. And they feel settled down. So it's not as though they feel entirely alienated. You see, this is what makes the place complex. Because usually there would be a feeling of estrangement, a feeling of alienation. Now she's suggesting that, in fact, if you speak to the Indians over there, and she did field work there, right? She's an anthropologist. And I'm not relying upon only on that. That's just one reading that we're doing in Dubai, but you can look at a number of other sources there. And I think it's very clear that if you speak to many of the Indians who've been living in Dubai for a period of time there, they do not feel that sense of estrangement and alienation. The Indian in a place like Trinidad, in some contexts, might feel more alienated, or in Fiji, given the political turmoil that you have. Now here you could say that you're habituated to the idea that you are not going to have citizenship at all. Okay? That there are certain spaces, public spaces, that in fact are not going to be available to you. That there's going to be certain restrictions on your mobility. Right? Now, all of this should tend to make a person feel somewhat alienated, somewhat at sea. But in fact, she is arguing is that the position is much more ambivalent, because yes, there are all these constraints and there are all these liabilities. And especially then when you get to this migrant laboring class as such, right, there the liabilities and constraints are enormous. You've already seen what they are. Your passport gets suspended, you might get beaten up, trying to go to the police and lodge a complaint, nothing is going to materialize. Attempting to have the Indian embassy intervene on your behalf if you're a migrant laborer, right, what is that going to do? Now, if perhaps there were 15 or 20,000 of them en masse who made a representation, it might have a certain effect. And in fact, once in a while, you're going to read a newspaper account of Indians who, finally get fed up and say that, well, we're going to revolt, right? We're going to, wage a strike. We're going to complain against the working conditions, and then you'll hear about it in the Indian newspapers, and of course after a few days the story will fade away. Because one of the things she's also pointing out is that there is a widespread feeling amongst the Indians in places like Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, the Gulf states more broadly, that the Indian state is not sufficiently or even remotely, in fact, actually invested in what happens to these people. And one of the reasons it isn't, frankly, is precisely because the bulk of them, in fact, belong to the laboring class, to the working class. Right? So that the Indian government itself, obviously, there are class interests that dictate who the Indian government is going to take interest in. Now, there are times when they have to do it. There are times when India has to officially lodge a complaint, right? But this is largely for rhetorical purposes. And one of the reasons why it has to do it because much of this laboring force is, from the point of view of the Indian state, a surplus laboring force, and these people are sending remittances back. Right? Now, the remittances per head have diminished, in fact, actually, significantly, and they've diminished because as Dubai grew, as the expat population grew, as the skyscrapers and the casinos, as it were, the Louvre, which is one of the greatest museums in the world, now has a branch, okay, right? And many of the museums are doing it. The Museum of Modern Art, right? So, and theme parks, 7-star hotels. I mean, there are accounts of the kind of lavishness that has been spread around in places like Dubai. What does that do? It increases the cost of living. So one of the arguments that has traditionally been made is that, well, we should allow this force to go, this labor force to go, because not only is this labor force unemployable in India, that we have already a substantial number of unemployed people, but in fact, these people send back money, so these overseas remittances are considerable. That used to be the argument. But per head, these overseas remittances have declined significantly over the last 15, 20 years. Okay, so let me recapitulate what she's really saying. I'm not giving you the entirety of the argument, and I'm not looking at all the other allied documents as well. But what she's really saying is, number one, that Dubai does not fit neatly into the category of what we considered an Indian diaspora group to be like. Okay, so these are people, many of these Indians, and again, keep in mind these different strata that I've talked about. Many of these Indians have put down roots. Some, of course, have come in very recent years and will go back after a short stint. Right? They put down roots there, and yet they haven't. Yet they haven't because eventually putting down roots, at least according to a liberal secular template, means you become a citizen of that place. But in fact, they cannot become citizens. That's a constraint, and a liability. So we cannot view the processes of naturalization and voluntary migration through which we have understood the diasporic Indian populations in the United States or Canada or Britain in recent decades. We cannot view that as a template to understand what these what the population in Dubai and UAE is like. Secondly, that for many Indians, Dubai in fact is very much like home, notwithstanding all these liabilities. And what creates a sense of home? It's a sense of community, the proliferation of Indian food, Indian cuisine, Indian music, so forth and so on. Right? The fact that the Arab population has also embraced many aspects of this culture. And in fact, one of the things she also points out is that, in fact, there is very little interaction sometimes. So how does the state of Dubai, let me pose a question this way. How does the state of Dubai make its presence felt in the mind of Indians? Well, one way it makes its presence felt is simply by excluding them from certain things. But otherwise, in day-to-day, everyday life, what are the forms of exclusion? There may not be many, but there may be constraints. So one good example would be Ramadan, right? So some of you may not be familiar with it, but I think most of you probably are. That's the month of fasting, the holy month of fasting, that you are supposed to observe as a Muslim. Now, I know, by the way, myself, that having gone to Malaysia many times over the last 10 years, one of the significant changes I've seen in Malaysia, I'll get back to Dubai in a second, I'm just giving you a comparison here. One of the significant changes that has taken place in Malaysia is that, that of course Muslims may not eat, okay, from after sunrise until sunset. Okay, and eating establishments could not by law in Malaysia serve food to Muslims. Or even water, by the way. You're not supposed to eat, drink, smoke in public at all. Now the difference is, this change that has occurred in Malaysia is that there's a significant number of Hindus, for example. Right? And Hindus, of course, do not observe Ramadan. But eating establishments now cannot even serve non-Muslims in Malaysia. Okay? So you're seeing the increasing Islamicization. Of course, the other argument that is given by the advocates of this is that, well, this is not Islamicization, this is simply a matter of observing the Sharia and paying respect to local Muslim traditions. Of course, the question is, when did it become a local Muslim tradition that even Hindus or Christians cannot eat during the day, right? And that eating establishments cannot serve them. Now, we know that they cannot serve Muslims. Now, in Dubai here, she is pointing out that this is in fact very strictly observed, that you cannot be found eating, drinking, and when I say drinking, I'm not talking about alcohol, obviously, I'm talking about water, because alcohol is obviously banned. I'm talking about water. You cannot be found drinking even water, right, for this entire period from sunrise until sunset, okay, for this month of fasting. And so this is the way in which the state might intrude upon you, but all right, this is 1 month of the year. So by and large, the suggestion she is making is that this is, not something that is overwhelmingly important from the point of view of Indians. It does not create that sense of alienation or estrangement that you think it might. Because she is trying to suggest is she's creating this very ambivalent sort of this position of ambivalence, whereby she's saying that, well, Indians have put down roots and yet they haven't. Okay, and when you start looking at the Indians living in Dubai, you find that some of them have been settled there for a period of time. Some of them are habituated to the life forms there, and they understand that there are rhythms of life that they must accept. Okay, and one thing that makes Dubai palatable to them, despite the liabilities, is the fact that India's influence is pervasive in many ways. Right? And this is where things like cuisine and music and so forth and so on come in. Right? Then there's the question of proximity to Dubai. Proximity to Dubai. So that certainly some people are able to move back and forth very, very frequently. Okay? And then this obviously alters Dubai as a diasporic setting in comparison to, let's say, Trinidad or Suriname or Guyana, where you would not have this back and forth, right? as you do in the case of Dubai. Now, she has a little discussion, and I want to just conclude my discussion of this portion with a reference to what she says about the term NRI. Okay, so many of you may have heard of it. This is the non-resident Indian. And she points out that this term non-resident Indian was in fact actually invented really for Indians in places like Dubai. It was invented for them. Okay? So these are Indians who have gone overseas. They're no longer resident in India. Right? That's what the non-resident Indian is. However, on account of various circumstances, eventually, by the early 1990s, in fact, the NRI term really began to be viewed as almost synonymous with the Indian who was living in the United States. And so there were further distinctions that were introduced. I just want to mention what these distinctions are. So you've got PIO, okay, which is people of Indian origin. So this is an official status, by the way, you know. It's an official status. So, you know, for example, when you enter India and you fill out the landing card, so, you know, they'll ask you, you know, are you an NRI or PIO or overseas OCI, overseas citizen of India? Okay? Which of these are you? You know, if any, of course, you may not be any. You may just have left India on a tourist visa for 1 week to go to Switzerland, and then you're back in India, right? But if you are any of these, take it off. Okay? So overseas citizen of India, India, by the way, does not permit dual citizenship. So overseas citizen of India is very misleading. Many people think that this means that you actually have political rights. When I say political rights, I mean the right to vote, effectively, because that's the first instance of what it means to have a political right, is the right to vote. So if you are an Indian holding an American passport, you cannot vote in an election in India. Okay? So because India does not permit dual citizenship. But what the OCI does, the overseas citizen of India, is if you're able to get the OCI card, and this is why I'm getting into it, I want to describe very briefly the politics of these categories, because it'll give you a very good sense of how there is still a kind of discrimination between the Indians who are living here and the Indians who are living, when I say here, I mean the US or the global north, and the Indians who are living in places like Fiji or Guyana and so forth. Right? It'll give you a very good sense of how this discrimination works. So what is the OCI, overseas citizen of India? So you're an Indian holding an American passport, which means you're now an American citizen, but you're of Indian origin. And if you get an OCI, it means once you have paid that sum of money and you have gotten what effectively looks like a second passport. Okay, looks like one, but in fact is not, and it cannot be because India does not have dual citizenship, right? So therefore you cannot have passports of two countries, but it looks like one, right? So it creates this effect. And what does it mean? Once you get that OCI card, it means that you can go to India for the rest of your life without a visa. You can travel back and forth and you never need a visa. It means you can own property in India and not worry about regulations that restrict ownership of property in certain cases, right? So forth and so on. It gives you most of the entitlements that you would have as an Indian citizen, except that you cannot vote and you cannot work for certain kinds of government establishments, right? Those are the restrictions. The PIO is a slightly lower version of the OCI. It's a slightly lower version, right? So usually the OCI gives you lifelong visiting rights to India without a visa. The PIO will not do that. It gives it to you for a shorter period of time. Okay? And then there's this category called the NRI, which, as I pointed out to you, was in fact actually invented for Indians in places such as Dubai. The idea being that these are people who had left India but were now non-resident, okay, but eventually would perhaps really come back. Okay? And then for various circumstances, this term began to be used really effectively only to refer to the Indians living in the United States and the global north. And so if you look at these marriage ads that we had seen in one of the previous classes, very often it would say, you know, looking for groom, minimum 5 feet 5 inches, must have a graduate degree, NRI card holder preferred. Okay, it would say that very openly in the marriage ad, that the person who has placed that ad is saying that I would like a partner, a marriage partner who's settled down as an NRI. And if the NRI card holders happen to be somebody who was living, okay, let's say in Somalia, okay, well, obviously it wouldn't count. In fact, it would be a liability. It would be a huge liability. So you can see by that implicitly, since it was simply mentioned NRI, it really meant the Indian, okay, who was now living in the United States or in some other part of the global north, in Canada, Australia, so forth and so on. All right, now, where does the discrimination come in? To get an OCI card, initially, when the Indian government came up with this scheme, it said that OCI cards would only be available to Indians, people of Indian origin who were now citizens of another state. Remember, you have to be a citizen of another state to get the OCI card. It would only be available to Indians living in the United States, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom. Well, why those four? Right? Why set up this tiered system? No, then they subsequently expanded it to a few more countries. Now it's, I think, about 10 countries. Right? But you still cannot get an OCI card if you are a person of Indian origin having, let's say, Sri Lankan citizenship. You cannot get an OCI card. Right? Because, so what it was intended to do was it was intended to essentially, because think about it, why is it doing it? So we are moving into the next phase of our discussion here now, because remember the last phase of our discussion, which is this week, is how do we begin to think of the politics of the diaspora? How do we begin to think of the future of the Indian diaspora? Okay? What is its relationship to India itself? How do we assess it in what is supposedly, I say supposedly because I don't buy the argument at all, supposedly and period in which we now have post-national states, for example. Right? So one of the readings that you have for week 10, begins to talk about post-national states. How do we start thinking of polities when we go beyond the nation state? Because the nation state has far from disappeared. In fact, it's become deeply entrenched in the last 10, 15 years. Even as these articles were being written, the nation state system continued to be deeply entrenched in many ways. Notwithstanding the fact that there are phenomena such as globalization going on, whatever that might mean. Right? Notwithstanding the fact that there are obviously transnational organizations that are at work in the world today. And when I say transnational organizations, I'm referring obviously to such organizations as Amnesty, Greenpeace, okay, Doctors Without Borders. These are transnational organizations. Right? But you can see the limitations immediately, because Doctors Without Borders cannot go and work in a country unless that country gives the workers of Doctors Without Borders permission to work in that country. You cannot be representing that organization and simply say, oh, I can walk into Somalia or Haiti. Let me help the cholera-stricken population of Haiti. All I need to do is flash my Doctors Without Borders card. No, it's not going to work. Right? So, but we'll assess that problem later on. We'll assess that problem slightly later on. What we're looking at over here is the following scenario. That one of the reasons why these categories such as OCI and PIO were brought into operation was that as India entered into the period of neoliberalization, right, India became concerned that it should obviously make the country hospitable to foreign investment. What moved India to embrace neoliberalization policies? In 1989, the country had no foreign exchange reserves at all. Zero. Its foreign exchange reserves had finished completely. Okay? Now you're talking about foreign exchange reserves of something like $300 billion US in India. China, of course, it's like 2 trillion or something. I mean, when I last compared the figures in an article that I'd published in 2007, the difference was still about 600-700 billion US dollars. Now the difference is itself about $2 trillion. China's foreign exchange reserves are just astronomical at this point in time. Okay, but India obviously established its foreign exchange reserves. I, by the way, am not giving you an argument for neoliberalization because I'm not an advocate of that policy, but I'm just giving you, explaining to you in 1989, according to the conventional scenario, this is one reason why India had to open itself up. Okay, that the policies that it had pursued up till that point in time had not proved to be productive. The country was stagnant, not showing any real growth. Again, we'll have to say, what does growth mean if we were doing a serious analysis of these questions, right? And who does the growth benefit? Is it disproportionate in its effects? And it clearly is. So 1989, neoliberalization policies are adopted. The first thing India has to think about is, well, how do you get people to invest, right? And of course, the first people you want to attract are your own people. Right? Thinking that, well, an Indian who is left India and is living in the United States must still have sentiments of loyalty. They must still have nostalgia. They must be thinking of the sarson ka saag. You remember the Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge movie, right? They must be thinking of the cornbread and the spinach, of the verdant fields of the Punjab. Now, how do we get these people interested enough to invest in India? So one of the ways in which you get them interested enough is you make the climate of investment more hospitable. You say that, all right, even if you're an American citizen, guess what? You get the OCI card and you can come to India the rest of your life and never have to get a visa. Right? Because frankly, these are the little annoyances that, I feel it all the time. They carry an Indian passport, which means that for every country in the world except Nepal and Bhutan, right, I have to get a visa. And if getting a visa for Britain or the European Union, they make it as difficult, as they possibly can. So they want to know, where your grandfather and where your grandmother was born, right? And how many times your grandfather and your grandmother visited Great Britain. Can you imagine, right? I mean, some of the data that they asked for is just extraordinary, right? So this is all a comment, by the way, too, on this idea of the post-national state. I mean, borders have become very tight in recent years, very, very tight. You've got surveillance regimes, immigration regimes, which frankly are in some cases almost tyrannical. So these little gestures might seem very little, but they're not, because what did the OCI do? It not only ensured that you could go back and forth between India, and I'll explain to you just how much of an asset it became in recent years. There's a man that very few of you would have heard of, some of you may have if you've been reading the news for the last 10 years, a man called Headley. So Headley is an American who was implicated in the terrorist attacks that took place in India. You might remember the burning of the Taj, the terrorist attack that took place on the Taj Hotel in Bombay. It was all over the news, all over the world. Right? And it went on for about 72 hours. A number of Americans, by the way, were killed as well during the terrorist attack. So this man called Headley, who is supposed to have been implicated in this as well. Now, the role of Headley, very briefly, as far as the Indian state was concerned, was that he was able to move back and forth between India and Pakistan. So that he was orchestrating, he was scouting, these sites in India for his terrorist friends in Pakistan. So one of the rules that the Indian government implemented, and as the Indian government usually implements these rules without any announcement, so if you get caught right in the middle, then you're really stuck badly. Okay, the Indian government has an absolute genius for this sort of thing. Okay, and what was one of these rules that they implemented? The rule that they implemented was, you're a foreigner, you've come to India on a tourist visa, and you have a multiple entry visa. It says multiple entry. Okay, you've come to India on a tourist visa, and while you're staying there, you decide, oh, I'm going to go to Nepal for about 15 days, because Nepal, as you know, is a bordering state, and many people do go to Nepal. And then I'll come back to India again. Well, guess what? You go to Nepal, And then when you try to re-enter India and it says multiple entry visa, your visa is good, the Indian government says, sorry, you cannot come in. Why? Because we have implemented a new rule thanks to Headley, and the new rule is that if you leave India, right, you cannot re-enter the country within 60 days. Even if you have a multiple entry visa, you cannot re-enter the country. So you've left all your luggage at your hotel, and you've gone to Nepal for 5 days, you come back, sorry, you can't re-enter India. Now you'll have to go back to the US and then come back after 60 days. This rule was in effect for 4.5 years. Okay? And everybody was caught unawares, people who had gone on tourist visas. Now if you had an OCI card, you were exempt from that rule. It didn't matter. And I learned all of this because I'd gone with my family to Turkey. We were living in India, and when we came back, my son did not have an OCI. The rest of the family did. I have an Indian passport, so I've got no issue. And they said, we can't allow your son back into the country. He was 10 years old at that time. We can't allow your son back into the country. Why can't you allow him back into the country? Oh, well, haven't you heard of this rule? No, I haven't heard of this rule. The whole world has the immigration. That's how they speak to you. The whole world has. How come you haven't? I said, really? Where does it say that? He says, it says that on your visa. I said, show it to me. And of course it didn't, because this visa he had was issued before the rule came into effect. Many visas are good for 5 or 10 years. The visa was issued long before the rule came into effect. It doesn't say that anywhere in the visa. Anyhow, we were detained for 2 hours, but eventually we were allowed back in, because I guess it struck him that my 10-year-old son was not a likely candidate for the Al-Qaeda membership, right? You see what I'm saying? That you might think, oh, this is trivial. No, it's not trivial. It's not trivial because these things mean a lot. At least that's how the Indian state thought about it. So, you give out these goodies, the OCI, the PIO status, but highly discriminatory, hierarchical, intended only for Indians coming from the affluent West, not Indians coming from Fiji, okay, or Uganda or Kenya. So there is a politics. Now, and Dubai complicates the politics further. She's arguing, right, to go back to Dubai, because what we're talking about is a scenario where, well, frankly, all the categories don't really quite work. This is really not part of the established Indian diaspora. Okay, many of these people will go back, some will not, but even the ones who don't go back, they don't really have any rights in that country, and yet they feel settled down. So they're not expats, not all of them are migrant laborers. Okay, the template of citizenship does not really work. The experience of secular states, secular liberal states, is not very productive in understanding their situation either. Right? So this is that fourth model. You remember I started, let me recapitulate in just 1 minute and let you go then. So I was saying that, and by the way, the 4 is not just like, it's not a magical number. We can, and these categories have collapsed already, some of them. But I was saying that, so if we're looking at this struggle for rights amongst Indians in the diaspora, okay, because clearly the first thing to understand is that not all Indians in the diaspora are privileged. Far from that. Let's not take the US and the highly affluent professional Indian community in the US as an example. Right? That there are Indians scattered all over, and I was giving you this, I had described for you in some detail the situation of Malaysia in my previous lecture. Right? And I've described, of course, other scenarios. So, in totality, we are saying that, yes, there are these struggles going on. One set of situations has to do with Indians confronting what you might call nationalism, and we had looked particularly at black nationalism. So Uganda, Kenya would be illustrations of that. Okay, but Burma would be an illustration of Indians confronting nationalism as well, because after independence in Burma, there was a demand that the Indians should be driven out. Then we're talking about a second scenario, which are struggles in countries such as the United States. That there are struggles here. That book Taxi, which I didn't get to today, but I will talk about it briefly, and you certainly must read it, because it illustrates a number of these problems that we want to look at. All right? that there are struggles in countries such as the United States as well. Okay? And when I say Indians here now, I'm also including broadly other South Asians such as Pakistanis and Bangladeshis. And thirdly, we're talking about situations such as that of Dubai, right? Wherever you've got Indian migrant labor going, but migrant labor in quotation marks for reasons that I've already discussed. And fourthly, we have described scenarios such as that which were to be found and are to be found still in countries such as Trinidad, Guyana, where you have an intense racial divide. You have an intense racial divide. South Africa has an intense racial divide as well. But in South Africa, the tiered system was a bit more complicated because you're talking about you're not only talking about Indians and Africans, you're also talking about colored people. You're talking about white people. Okay? And I've not been able to illustrate the complexity of that because the South African situation is very unique. We would have to spend really a whole couple of weeks on South Africa itself. It's very unique partly because it gives the lie to the argument which people have taken from Uganda, that Indians were never invested in that country. When I say invested, I don't mean financially invested, that they were never emotionally, culturally invested in that country. Right? That's the argument that Idi Amin gave for expelling the Indians. Let's throw them out because these people are still strangers. They won't marry our daughters, so forth and so on. In South Africa, by contrast, and that's why it gives a lie to this argument, in South Africa, Indians unquestionably had a major role to play in the anti-apartheid struggle. There's just no question about that. And the black South African government that was installed, okay, after the end of apartheid, when Mandela was released and won the first election and was elected president, recognized the role of Indians because it gave a huge number of seats to Indians in the first cabinet, out of all disproportion to their numbers. If you go to South Africa, people like Ahmed Kathrada, Billy Nair, Fatima Mir, and many others are in fact legendary heroes. I mean, one of my favorites is Yusuf Dadu, who was an Indian Muslim South African who was head of the South African Communist Party. You see, most people don't even think that, they think that Islam, if you're Muslim, you're going to be completely hostile to communism, Very progressive person, and in fact, when he passed away some years ago, Mandela said very clearly that, because Mandela issued a statement that this man is a giant in South African history, but hardly anybody remembers him outside South Africa. So there are complexities that we are not able to obviously cover here because each of these situations is also quite different in some respects. But nonetheless, I think the template that I've given you of these different kinds of struggles, I think, is still productive. All right?